Okay. Okay, good morning to everyone on screen. What I'm going to do today is every so often I will pause so that if someone on the screen on Zoom has a comment or question, I'll be able to pause and interact. I know this hybrid model is we're still getting used to it. So welcome, good morning, almost good afternoon. I want to actually answer two questions that Mimi brought up, Barash last week that I looked into at her request. You'll share them with her, Sandra, Sandy, when she comes. The first was the question of whether babies who lo aleinu die, stillborns, or babies who die before they have a brit milah are circumcised. The answer is yes. The Chevra Kadisha does it. It's not a halachic requirement. In other words, it seems to be more of a Kabbalistic ritual, something that's done because we on earth there's comfort in our performing this mitzvah for the child and sending him off into the next world with this completion of the mitzvah. So that was one thing I looked into. And the second thing was the naming of baby boys. It's only a minhag that we wait until the brit. In other words, there's no reason we can't name our children, both boys and girls, without ritual. The practice has been to have an aliyah and name a baby girl in shul, and to name the baby boy at the bris. But it turns out, and I started hearing more and more stories, that people do in fact name baby boys, especially if they know the baby is premature and it's going to be a while till the bris. They give them a name and call them by a name, and that makes sense, because to wait as long as you wait can be very emotionally draining. The name gives us a connection. We see that over and over in Breshit. Giving the name, giving the child a name gives the child an identity, both for the child and for the parent that begins to relate to that child. So it makes me now wonder, sometimes I get these refuah shlema WhatsApps to pray for a child who put hatinok ben, and I wonder if they have not been informed that they could in fact name the child if they wanted to. Obviously it's a personal choice. Yes.
Minnie just heard that they often name the child's middle name
and then they give them another name at the bris. Right. And all of that is minhag. In other words, the way we do things is often reflective of the minhagim we take on, and whatever gives us the strength to get through the challenges that sometimes come up are certainly worthwhile. Okay, so where I want to start this week, I want to go backward before going forward, because this is a Parsha class called Myriad Interpretations. I'm still playing a little bit with what I want to do. Please come in. No, I just started. On one hand, Parsha has the challenge of trying to find new material in material that we're very familiar with and that we have been learning for years and years and years. On the other hand, there's something exciting when you recognize how powerful the text is, that every year you go back to it and there are new ideas or perceptions or interpretations to mine. And given that it's Wednesday, certainly going into the end of the week, having an idea to bring on into the Shabbat table, I think is always wonderful. And so this week, I'm going to model an approach that I hope will certainly throughout Breshit be resonant with you. We're going to look at a number of, every Parsha has so many narratives, so many stories, so much to draw from, that instead of choosing one story, I'm going to rather choose interpretations that speak to me, something that I find gives a new perspective. And we're going to look at a number of stories through the lens of a new interpretation, at least new for me, or a new idea I want to share. And I want to start with Hagar. I'm always going to be drawn to the women in the stories, or almost always. Your mother, I'll talk to you after class. I found answers to the questions you asked last week. So, yeah. So I want to start with Hagar. I listened to and read a beautiful shiur by Rabbi Avital Hochstein through Hadar Online Torah that really spoke to me, that I think will help frame both Hagar's story last week and the story with Hagar and Yishmael this week. And I called it Seeing and Being Seen. The idea that when we're in relationship with one another, we often need to be seen in order to see, or when we see, we need those we're in relationship to see us as well. And a lot of rupture occurs when we feel we're not being seen, which is different than not being heard. Yishmael is about hearing, but El Roi, El Roi is about being seen. And we're going to see those two senses, the hearing, seeing, interplay really interestingly, both with Avraham and God in this week's Parsha, and with Hagar and Yishmael in the story before the Akedah. So we're going to go backward to Hagar and take a look in Genesis 16, Tet Zayin. We're going to see it in a moment. We're going to go inside with that. Okay, that's exactly, I'm just framing it. So we're in chapter 16. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to skip to the end with the Malach, but I want to just remind everyone, because we're going to look at Sarah. We're in a part of the relationship between God, Sarai, and Avram, when continuously God keeps promising Avram a child. No child is born, and Sarai takes the initiative here to give Avram her Shivcha Mitzrit Hagar. Okay, that's what Sarai does. We're familiar with the story. I will say that in the ancient Near East, there are several contracts that have been found of women who go into marriage stipulating that if the bride turns out to be barren, she will give her slave to her husband to bear a child for her, what we would call a surrogacy agreement, an ancient surrogacy agreement. And we see it in Mesopotamia in 1900 BCE, in Assyria in 1600 BCE, and in Anatolia, which is Turkey, in 500 BCE. In other words, two of those dates sync very well with the story we're reading here, which is at around 1800 BCE, right? And so the reason I start with this is I remember being startled when Rabbi Elchanan Samet began to use Code of Hammurabi, laws of Middle Assyria and so on, to frame some of the stories in the Torah. And it was enormously helpful because I think we are morally troubled by Sarai's behavior, but I don't believe the Torah is as morally troubled as we are, because the Torah is both eternal and particular. In other words, certain stories can only be understood to some degree within the context of the world in which they are being written, right? That the time and the place and the frame in which they're being written. The wonder of the stories is that thousands of years later, we're still reading and responding to them. So it is not out of place for us to ask about Sarai's behavior towards Hagar and to wonder about our own relationships with those who are under us, those who are at a lower status than we are, and so on. We can use this story to ask about how we treat those who are dependent upon us, our workers, our servants, our cleaning staff, and so on and so forth. However, I found it helpful to understand that the time and place in which the story is taking place, Sarai's behavior would have been not just reasonable, but expected. In other words, there's a difficult dynamic here. The slave of the woman is being given to the husband to bear a child. In an ideal situation, she's just a womb. And Hagar refuses to be that, which makes Hagar a much more interesting character for our purposes. Much more interesting than Bilhah and Zilpah, who seem to be more compliant with what is expected of them, right? Really, perhaps again, a better relationship with Rachel and Leah than Hagar has with Sarai. I'll also say the Mitzrite piece, the Egyptian piece, is certainly interesting because Sarai was in slavery in Egypt. She had no agency. She was taken into Pharaoh's house. She was oppressed, and now she's the oppressor. Really, really interesting to think about that. What happens when someone goes free and yet continues a pattern of behavior that they suffered from, and yet that's something that they pass forward, so to speak. So we can look at that missed opportunity, that Sarai perhaps had an opportunity to treat Hagar differently, but doesn't do that. On the other hand, the way she treats Hagar is what in the world of the ancient Near East would have been legitimate. How dare the slave begin to act like the master, right? And so we understand so many different currents and threads and possibilities here, which is what makes the story so interesting and rich with the different scenes that could have unfolded if each woman had acted a little differently, if Avram had acted a little differently, right? There's so much we can, which door do you open? Which story do you walk through? That's where Midrash, by the way, often comes in and finishes narratives, multiple narratives. It'll take a story and give us multiple endings to the story. We're going to see some of that in different stories later today. So I'm just reminding us of the backdrop to the story when Hagar responds to her pregnancy by looking down at her mistress. Sarai responds with inui, with literally abusive treatment, which the Midrash tries to say, no, she just reminds her she's a slave, right? Which she makes her take out the garbage. She makes her, whatever it is, do things that are slave-like and are humiliating and remind Hagar of her place, right? That tension, and Hagar runs away. So I want to pause for a minute. Anyone on Zoom want to ask something or comment before I look at the rest of the story inside? And if you do, you have to remember to unmute. Otherwise, we are going to move on. So Hagar runs away. Vativrach mipaneha. I'm in verse 7. I will say, if you do have a smartphone, this Sefaria app is an excellent app to download. If you need help finding it, come to me after class. I have the entire Tanakh, Talmud, Mishnah, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch on my phone with English translation, and it's very easy to use. And that I'm also going to talk to Yael about ordering big JPS Tanakhs. I think Matan should have at least 10 or 12 like they do in other places I teach, so that it'll be more comfortable for you and I won't have to print sources that really, can you model this for us? Yes, this is what the Tanakh online looks like, right? It's very, very easy. That's the whole Tanakh with the English translation. It's a JPS translation. Right, you have it as well. See, right.
See, I have the Art Scroll one and it's not as good.
Not as good. Sefaria is very easy to use. So please come. We're in chapter 16, verse 7, Tet Zayin Zayin. And not only do I have to deal with hybrid, I have the guy vacuuming the Xerox machine. Okay. So what happens is, Vativrach mipaneha, Hagar's response is to run away. V'yimtza'a malach Adonai al ein hamayim bamidbar, al ha'ayin b'derech shur. So the malach Adonai, the angel of God, finds Hagar. I will say she is the only woman who has this kind of revelation, this direct conversation with some sort of divine emanation, with something godly. Vayomer Hagar shivcha Sarai im emizabat va'an telechi v'tomer b'nei Sarai gvirti anochi borachat. So what's interesting about this pasuk is she acknowledges that Sarai is her mistress, right? She says, I'm running away from my mistress, but that's part of the desperation that I'm going backwards, right? Here I thought I was moving upwards by becoming pregnant with Avram's child, and now I still have a mistress. Vayomer la malach Adonai shuvi al gvirtech v'hitani tachat yadeha. And basically the malach says, look, this is your lot in life right now. Go back to your mistress and submit to the treatment at her hands. Now, you recognize in that pasuk, of course, the promise Abraham is given by God, right? So this is an annunciation. This is a divine promise being given to the Hagar, the Mitzrite slave, the Shipra Mitzrite. Vayomer la malach Adonai hinach hara v'yoladet ben v'karat shmo Yishmael ki shama Adonai elanyech. And so I want to already comment because it's going to be relevant in this week's parsha. Yishmael's mode of connection to God, to others, is through hearing. His name means Yishmael, God hears, right? Ki shama Adonai, God hears. Now you're Anyech, right? On the other hand, it's the name for the child that is about to be born, has the sense of hearing associated with it. God has heard you. And we find out he's going to be a wild man. He's going to be a leader. He's going to have his hand in all things. Okay, and he's going to live among his brethren. Vatikra Shem Adonai Adover Ela Ata El Ra'i. Ki Amra Hagam Lamom Ra'iti Acharei Ro'i. So it's actually Hagar subverts the message of the angel. The angel talks to her about hearing, and Hagar instead uses the language of vision. And what she says is, Ata El Ra'i, you are God who has seen or who sees. There's a word play here, right? God has seen me and I have seen God, right? So I see, but even more importantly, God has seen me. Al ken kara the be'er l'chai ro'i, hine ben Kadesh u'ben Barad. Okay, and so it's between Kadesh and Barad. And so, so I want to focus on this moment that Hagar, God of my seeing, God I have seen, God who sees me, she essentially says, it's very nice that Yishmael is what is offered. Yishmael is that God has heard my distress in this particular area and has responded, but I want something more. I want to know that God sees me in my existence and my totality. God has heard my suffering, but my suffering is very particular to this situation. I want something bigger. I want to be seen. And I really think when we take a look at our story, Hagar is reaching for a relationship of seeing being seen rather than a relationship of being heard. Hearing, of course, is less tangible, right? That's sound waves, whereas when we see things, there's something tangible in sight. And so I think that Hagar is saying, I want a different relationship with you, God, and I want to know that you see me. Just one more moment, and then I'll take questions. And I'm going to quote Avital here. There is a value.
I'm sorry, who's
Avital Hochstein. I said I was some of these ideas came from Avital Hochstein's Torah, so I'm sorry. There is a value to my voice, to my words. So that is what she's being told. There's a value to my existence, she says. I hear what you're telling me. There's a value to my words. I want to know there's a value to my being. Feeling heard can allow me to feel seen. And I'm able to see God after God sees me. And I found that very profound because I think a lot about relationships with students, with children, with parents. I feel a lot about what happens when someone feels invisible. Right now, we're dealing with certain situations in our social dynamic in the Midrashah. Some of the students feel invisible, and how can we help them be seen by their peers, and so on and so forth. And the invisibility goes with sight. First, if I'm seen, then I can be heard. And I think Hagar recognizes, I want El Ro'i. I want to know God sees me, because then I'll be able to see God. And once I can see God, and once I'm seen, I can take that into my relationship with others. So I found that we're going to see at the end, right, that also there, she can't bear to see her child die, and yet God hears Yishmael's cry, right? There we're also going to have this interplay between seeing and hearing, which I'll come back to. And really what happens then is seeing the one who sees her, right? Seeing that God sees her allows her to give a name, El Ro'i, to this emanation, to this seeing that she sees of God. And by naming God, she shows an understanding of God. And so that takes us back to naming, by the way, why it's so important, I think, for us to name our children. And when a child is a newborn baby, we want to give the child a name. We see the child, we see the potential in the child. And then, of course, we hope the child begins to see us. So it is also interesting that Vayera, the Parsha, now I'm going to segue into our Parsha, begins with seeing. Vayera elav Adonai. We have not had that verb associated with Abraham until after the Hagar story, as if the Hagar story has introduced a new element in the relationship between God and others that Hagar has exposed. Hagar has striven for, perhaps. And I'll see that in Lech Lecha, God appears, but Abraham does not see God. God speaks to Abraham, Lech lecha al artzecha. God is the one who is active, but suddenly this shift here that God appears before Avram and Avram sees God, that's something new in their relationship. Okay, I'm now going to pause. You had a question.
I don't think I was first, but sure. Okay, two things. One, I would just say, I actually thought that I'd rather be heard than seen,
Mhm.
because women are objectified very often, so
Mhm.
that's interesting.
Very nice,
So
interesting.
to me, eyes
I'm not
trick
gonna go.
people,
Mhm.
men, ears are much more reliable, just wanted to say that. And then the second thing is, I'm really open to this concept I've never heard before, which is that Sarah abused Hagar. I have to tell you, I'm having a hard time, but okay. But I also, I'm just, yeah, you all
Oh,
wanna
I mean,
know
it's,
what
it's the verb.
The abuse.
Well,
Right.
it's the verb, I will say, the verb in the Torah is the verb Sarah abused Hagar. The word vita'aneha, Inoi, you're shaking your head all the time.
Well,
Inoi is it does mean a form of domination or mastery.
But that's
How
not
you-
abuse.
Yeah.
It's
Yes,
not abuse,
abuse.
and we use the same expression for Yom Kippur.
So I
Yeah.
bet.
Okay, wait, so finish your
Okay,
question,
so-
right?
So sorry, my Hebrew is
Yeah.
really poor,
Mhm.
but that's what I knew, and
Mhm.
I don't mean to, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm seem like I'm getting upset. I'm
Yeah.
not upset with you, but I think it's really dangerous
Mhm.
to say because Sarah dominated somebody, she was abusive. I feel like we are falling right into the trap. She's a strong woman, so there's a problem.
Mhm.
When we say men dominate,
Yeah.
it's seen as something good. And when Sarah dominates, when Sarah sets boundaries, when Sarah knows who she is, suddenly she's an abuser. So I don't mean to say that's what you're saying, but I'm saying that's how it's, that's
Right.
how I'm
That's your,
getting it.
that's what you're hearing.
Yes.
I will say the Midrash, by the way, takes its gloves off and has no problem
Sure.
saying Sarah was abusive. I mean, by the way, the word abuse is very, what is the word? Loaded for us.
Yeah.
Right, it's very loaded for us. But, so I do wanna acknowledge that in the Inoi, Ina, the word Ina, Aleph Nun Hey, what?
Yes,
In,
it's the Nitzan et Nafshotecha, the Yom Kippur. It's
yes,
not-
I know, but in
abusive.
relation to others, Shem is Aleph Nun Hey Dina. Amnon is Aleph Nun Hey Tamar. It's a complicated word.
Right.
It's a complicated word when two people are involved.
Okay.
I will say that the best probably explanation is not the abuse that we think of today when we think of spousal abuse. It is a mastery and a domination over a weaker individual. Let's use that. When it's a man and a woman, it can have sexual overtones. It doesn't necessarily mean beating. We tend to think of abuse as like an ongoing, but there is an element of humiliation and mastery. And there's no question, it is bad enough that Hagar runs away. So I don't want to minimize it either. I've said that in the ancient Near East, again, a mistress and her slave. Slaves in the Torah are open to a certain amount of what we would uncomfortably call domination and mastery. They are not independent. Canaanite slaves. Ivri slaves have more legal rights, but a non-Jewish slave in the Torah is meant to be treated with some command, you treat your animals kindly, you treat your maidservants and your male servants kindly, but you have the ability to have more mastery over them. And the Midrash, I should have brought some Midrashim, I didn't, but they're not afraid of that in the way that I think we're responding to. They don't need to be politically correct. And they're like, yeah, she made her do really terrible things. And she was very verbally I'm going to try not to use the word abusive, but if you read the Midrash, caustic, yes. And the Midrash is not afraid of it because to the Midrash that would have been acceptable. And for us, I hear what you're saying. I think it's a very the word Aleph Nun Hey is not the Anitem et Nafshotechem, where I have agency and choice to afflict myself to submit to God, right? As opposed to two people. With two people, Inui is going to be much more difficult for the person getting the Inui as opposed to when I choose to do the Inui to myself. So it is the same root, but it has very different implications. I have tried not to use the word abuse, rather mastery, domination. She is a slave. And as a slave, she is subject to a certain amount of lack of agency, lack of independence, which alone can be a form of frustration and restriction and oppression. I used the word oppression. I didn't use the word abuse. When you are a slave, you are the oppressed. We know that from Egypt, right? We wanted to leave slavery. And then what did they say, B'nai Israel? oh, we wish we could go back where we were being taken care of, where we had the kishu and so on and so forth. Meaning being a slave is not just being beaten, it's a loss of freedom, but if you have decent masters, you're being taken care of. I'll just say as an aside, and I want to say, I once got into a cab in the South with a black cab driver who was saying something about going back to the biblical times and the slavery of the Bible. And I was like, I really can't have this conversation with you right now. But it was really very interesting because I'm like, oh, okay. And because he saw I was a religious Jew. I teach Bible, I teach Talmud. That's how we got into the conversation. And he felt the Bible was correct and so on and so forth. Then I was like, wow. But he felt there was a compassion and a something good one could see in the biblical reflection. I was like, okay, but it was interesting. Again, it was interesting that someone could see in that dynamic the potential for something good. I cannot see that. Because I know it could be abused and it could become corrupted.
All right, but also, let's look at where she came from. She didn't come from a slave class. She was a princess.
That's a
So
midrash.
she
That's a
is
midrash.
woman.
That's a
Okay,
midrash.
but
That's a midrash.
But even so, where she came from, it's right.
She came from Egypt. Yeah.
Okay, she's seeing things from a different perspective, and maybe she was not used to being treated with this
Degree
of mastery, of dominance, of you do this and do that, and
So yeah, that would be the midrashic frame for why it's so hard for her, right? If we're going to the midrashic frame, then we have to allow Sarah to perhaps be more oppressive than we would like, but then we understand for her, the journey was more difficult.
right.
I could, by using the pshat, acknowledge that she is acquired by the family in the aftermath of Sarah coming out of Egypt and her experience, right? We know that Avram gains a lot of man and woman slaves in return for Sarah, right? So again, that's interesting that Rechush, right? She's part of that as they go out of Egypt. But as I said, this is a story that can be plumbed and returned to over and over again. What I wanted to look at is, to some degree, her saying, I don't want the Yishmael, I want the El Roi. And maybe for her, being seen is more important than being heard. And I think that, again, gives us permission. If I were doing this with a class where I turned it into a seminar, what's more important to you in a group dynamic, in your home, with your family, with your partners, right? Do you want to be seen? Do you want to be heard? Now, you want both. We want both. But which leads more to my sense of expression and selfhood? Is it first being seen and then I could be heard? Or is it first being heard and then I could be seen? She is not described as beautiful. Now, that to me is interesting, because perhaps a beautiful woman like Sarah is going to want hearing over seeing because she's constantly being objectified. It could be a less beautiful woman, Dafka, wants to be seen. Someone who's not described as beautiful wants to be seen, because we're always looking at beauty and not looking at someone who is not visually attractive. So again, you could do a lot. I'm just saying, even around the Shabbat table, there's a lot you could talk about here. Where do we feel we are more valued, right? When we're seen, when we're heard, or how do we play with those two things? Both exist in this story. And I'll just say, in the opening to our Parsha, V'yera, for the first time, we have this relationship between God and Abraham, in which there is something having to do with vision, that God appears. And it's like, now there's a shift in the relationship. And that's where I'm going to go next. Yes, you wanted to ask?
Without it being too long, in like maybe a sentence or two, would you be able to give your views of what you think she meant by saying, I want to be seen? Like, did she say physically? Did she mean internally? Like, what does that mean to be seen to her?
I think that what she's saying is as follows. I'm reaching for a God who sees me. And then, like, what I think is what really touched me is this idea that we look at God very universally. There's an exercise in Dov Zinger's book about prayer that I found very proud. It's called Tikkun Tefilati. I think it's called My Prayer, something like prayer. Beautiful book. One of the exercises is that I should visualize God seeing me. It was so powerful. I do it sometimes when I daven, right? This idea that God is seeing me, Nechama, Goldman, Barash, right? God is seeing me. It's very hard to even think about it. Maybe some of you already do it, but this visualize that I have to see myself as if God is seeing me, right? Being seen by God. And so I feel that she's choosing this relationship of God has allowed me to see him, because remember, the angel appears to her. And then she feels now that she's seen something of God, that oh, God sees me, meaning I've seen something of God and God sees me. And I think what I take from that is the layers within, right? In order to be seen, I have to see the other, but also I have to allow them to see me. And I feel it's just an aspect of the relationship that she's looking for, and almost like she's demanding. I don't want it to just be based on hearing. I want to be seen by God, which again, I'm open to thoughts. I just found that idea because I wrestle with that. Does God really see me? Or am I praying to this universal God or this enormous, am I really as an individual seen by God? And yes, we say we are, right? We know we're all counted and so on, but can I feel that? And Hagar's demanding that. And we're going to see at the end of the story, that's what I want to turn to, what happens there at the very end, where she again is going to be led to see and God hears Ishmael. We'll see in the end. I think I'm not fully, some of these ideas are new. I'm still developing them and working through them, which is why I'm bringing them in class on Zoom. Anyone have anything they want to say? I don't want to ignore those before I move on. Hold on one second.
Yeah, I wanted to say something. Hi,
Yeah.
Nechama, Helen.
Helen?
We see Sarah's reaction, but we don't actually see her pain. And I also have a bit of a trouble with this master-slave kind of relationship. And we've got to forget, we mustn't forget that the behavior stems from something. And I think we take that into account.
Absolutely. We don't want to minimize how painful it is for Sarai that Hagar is now pregnant after she's been trying for years and years and years. And look,
not just that, but her behavior towards her. I mean,
it's coming out of her own pain. It's coming out of her own pain.
No, it's Hagar. Hagar
treats Sarai bad. Yeah.
Sarah kind of knows.
Yes. I did say that earlier, that this is a very complex dynamic where Hagar now feels superior to the mistress. The mistress responds, as I said, certainly according to the time, in an appropriate way, reminding the Hagar that she is not the mistress. And it evolves from there. But absolutely, yes, this story is very, very complicated. And that's at the very beginning, I had said, would each character have behaved somewhat differently, the story would have looked very different. Meaning if I could, sometimes they have in high school, the kids write out, you're Hagar, you're Sarai, and write how you would behave in this situation. There were multiple possibilities here for the story to end differently if even one person had acted a little differently, whether it was Avram, who wasn't sensitive enough to what was happening in the household, whether it was Hagar, who immediately recognized, who did not behave badly to her mistress, or like there's so many things that could have played out here, but this is the story we have. And yes, I agree. No, Hagar is not blameless.
Could the Aleph Hey mean discipline rather than oppress?
I'd have to, you know what? I have the biblical dictionary right here on my phone.
Sorry.
Okay. Let me anyone else have a question while I look that up? We need to use the words the way they appear in the Torah before we then interpret, which is fine. We can interpret on top of that. But let me just see if the BDB suggests something that might go in that direction. Anyone else have a question? I know you had your hand up. Just make sure I finish with the Zoom people. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, I suppose it's obvious, but when somebody wants to be seen, this is not the external person who wants to be seen. They want to be seen for themselves, for their inside, for who they really are. It's not just to be seen outside.
Yes, you don't need God to see your external beauty or lack of beauty. You want to know God sees you inside. Yes, I think that is what she is. That is what she is seeking. She is seeking that aspect of their relationship. And so again, I find it interesting that Vayerai Lav Adonai is after this story, right? That first encounter with Resh Ayin Aleph Hey is really between God and Avram after Hagar kind of changes changes the dynamic and says, I don't want hearing, I want seeing. You wanted to ask something, please?
One comment. First of all, you spoke about the times.
The what?
The times.
Yes.
And the times it was a slave culture.
Yes, absolutely.
So there was nothing exceptional about the way that she treated her slave.
Right.
That's number one.
Right.
And but generally speaking, isn't seeing considered lesser than hearing?
Well, when Moshe sees the burning bush, I'm not sure, meaning even there's a midrash that they saw, no, it's in the Torah, that they saw the kolot and the ra'amim, right? They saw the sounds, that was at Sinai. So I don't know, meaning that I'd have to explore more deeply. Is there one sense that's preferred over the other? Is seeing, and right, sight is, I think because sight is very tangible. Okay, so what I want to look at the end, I'm still quickly trying to find it. Of course, the nun is Aleph Nun Hey. The way it works here is I have to scroll
I
all
have
way.
that bias as well, that to hear is better than to see, but.
Interesting, right? We bring our bias into it, which is why I think it's an interesting and rich conversation. I'd like to move on, but I'd like to just show you the end of the story with Hagar. It's this week's Parsha. Take a look at the end. We're now in chapter 21, Kaf Aleph. We're gonna. This story is so complicated, and the fact that Avram, who is enormously wealthy, sends them off with a jug of water and a loaf of bread. I don't want to ignore that that puzzlement. Why he couldn't send them off with 3 donkeys and a few camels and a servant to take them to Egypt. I don't know. I certain things are puzzling. But what I want to look at is Vayichlu Hamayim, verse Tet Zayin. Vayichlu Hamayim in Achemet. The water runs out. Which again, often our lens is that of critical of Hagar, largely because rabbinically, midrashically, we often like the good and the bad. We like binary. What's clear, that Yishmael is the rejected son, so there must have been a fundamental flaw in Yishmael, rather than wrestle with the complexity of God rejecting one child over another throughout Bereshit. Right, there we have the Re'eh. She can't bear seeing the death of her child, but she's opposite him, right? She's far enough away not to see, but she's close enough that she's aware of what's happening. And now she cries out, right?
She's feeling sorry for herself, not him.
You're bringing, because you're biased against Hagar.
No, I'm sorry, which mother who has a sick child
would leave the
throws him
child
off and doesn't hold him?
Yes, she puts him. Look, you know what? We're not going to debate. We're not going to debate Hagar. She doesn't want to see him die. I don't want. Yes, okay. Vayishma Elohim et kol hana'ar. So we have God hearing the. Now it's interesting. We hear she has raised her voice in pain, and then God hears the voice of the nar ba'asher husham. Right? God hears the voice Yishmael. Remember, that's his name. And then what happens next is Kumi siyat hanar va'achziki yadecho ki legoy gadol asimenu. Vayifkach Elohim et eineha v'tera be'er hamayim. Right. So really, this very, I think, I haven't gotten to the bottom of it. I'm still thinking about it, but he hears Yishmael, who we don't hear, but God hears, right? And then he allows Hagar to see what's really before her eyes. So there's some split between the senses in terms of God's relationship with Yishmael versus God's relationship with Hagar. And then, of course, and then what does his mother do? So basically his wife takes him, his mother takes him a wife from Egypt. I want to look at a surprising midrash around that pasuk. The story ends well. In other words, there is a happy ending in that there's salvation and God hears and God allows to see, and then they go down to the desert. That was what I was interested in, not debating Hagar's role. Certainly a very difficult story, and on the face of it, hard to explain. Equally hard to explain how Avram, an enormously wealthy man, sends them off with a jug of water and a loaf of bread. My own personal reading is, in the aftermath of such a send-off, she feels very invisible, right? You're sent away from a family where you have lived for many years with essentially nothing, to die in the desert. She needs to rely on God,
And yet,
right?
according to the midrash, she goes back to him.
Yes, I'm gonna like Keturah. Yes, we'll get to Keturah. That's next week's parsha. Okay, so what I want to look at next. Okay, so yes.
This could be the Nahar.
But he can't.
He's like 20 something years
Yeah,
old.
26,
Yes, yes, the
27.
midrash, this is where midrashic interpretation comes in and tries to explain why the language of the text has us look at him as a young boy. The pit up, yeah, yes.
This whole story, it's weird wording for Ishmael. Is he, at one point.
Is he a yeled? Is he a nar? Is he a grown man?
He's
Yeah.
like 20 something.
Right.
Yes, I'm not, yes, and that's why this is, certainly over Shabbat, you are welcome. I'm still looking for Ina, I'm not ignorant. It's taking me a long time to get to it.
No, Yitzchak was 13 years younger than.
Then
Yes,
Yishmael,
but by the
14
time he
14 years, I
appeared,
think.
he was a
No, we're
grown
not
man.
Okay. Cohabitation, hold on, I found Ina, testify against, hold on, let's see, I want to find the Ina of the, okay, answer, respond. No, I'm gonna have to actually go get the okay. What I want to do now is move to a different frame. That was one frame and something I hope I'll inspire you to think about and go back to. And as you go through the Parsha, think about where the words seeing and being seen appear. And even the idea that after the Hagar story, God says, Hitalech lefanai, right? Only then does he say to Abraham, walk before me, which is a very, he moves from a solitary journey of lech lecha, right? Go to walk before me, relational walking before God. So this sense of God sees Abraham as Abraham is walking forward, right? There's something relational from the hitalech lefanai that is not there in the lech lecha. So again, something else to think about, another thread perhaps to tie in. Let's take a look at hachnasat orchim. So now we're going to shift to a different frame in the parsha. I just opened and closed the idea of seeing, hearing. Now we're going to look at Avram, who sees others, right? He's very good at seeing the orchim. So now we're in chapter 18. So I'm not going to tie together every idea. I brought that. We've closed that. Some of you may have responded, some not, but we're going to move on to V'yirei lav Adonai be'elonei mamrei. V'hu yoshev petach ha'ol kechom ha'ol yom. Vayisa einav vayar v'hinei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav. Vayar varatz likratam v'yishtachavu arza, and he brings them into his home and he makes them, and we know he runs and he prepares food for them, and he says to Sarah as well, Lushi v'asi ugot, right? The couple together are welcoming the guests. So I want to look at a beautiful idea that appears in Bereshit. Now we're on the source sheet. Is there an extra one? Yes, there is. Can you give me that? Thank you. Yeah, pass me a source sheet. Everyone have their extra source sheets here?
Yes, here's another one.
I have one. Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav, Gdola hachnasat orchim me'akabalat pnei hashchina. Hospitality towards guests is greater than receiving the divine presence. Now again, some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not. It's an astonishing statement, right? And we're going to try to understand a little bit that what the Midrash is trying to say here. He basically says, God, kind of wait here while I go tend to the guests. Here in he basically says to well, it's a midrashic wordplay. Vayomer Adonai imna matzati chen beinecha. It's Adoni. Adonai. Yeah. He's saying it to, presumably he's talking to the guests, but the wordplay is he's talking to God, right? It's not written Yud K and Vav K. It's not written in the normal way we write God's name. It's pronounced the same way. And there's a question of who is Avram talking to. The pshat is please stay, come into me. Instead, the Midrash says, Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass. In other words, wait for me. And that midrashic idea, that it's a very beautiful reading, is that God and Avraham are in relationship, in conversation, and he turns to God and says, can we pause this while I go to do this? Which to me, the profundity here of our relationship with God, the horizontal and the vertical, that we are continuously in relationship with God when we're in relationship with one another. I talk about this in Tishrei. I think it's one of the most profound ideas, that our relationship with God is not only about doing acts directly this way, it is most significantly doing the acts this way in the horizontal. And that, take a look at the next text, that it then says, Rabbi Elazar says, Bo'arei shelo k'midat HaKadosh Baruch Hu midat basar vadam ein katan yachol lomar legadol hamtein ad she'avo etzlacha So basically, Rabbi Elazar says you can never get away with this among human relations. You can never a worker cannot say to his boss, "Just wait a minute while I go take care of something." Which, by the way, I don't think is completely true. If there's trust in a relationship, you can probably say to your boss, "Can you hold on? I need to go take care of my mother who is ill and in the hospital." Right? We hope that those are the relationships we have. But what they're saying is God is mivater on his kavod so that we can do mitzvah, which again, I think is the idea that we're teasing out here. And then Rav Yehuda Bar Shela says, Shisha dvarim adam ochel perotem ba'olam hazeh, ba'keren kayemet lo la'olam haba. There are 6 matters a person enjoys the profits of in this world, and the principle is olam haba. And notice the examples. Hachnasat orchim, bikor cholim, Iyun tefillah, which is prayer, right? Hashkamat Beit Midrash, learning in the Beit Midrash. V'hamigadel banav l'talmud Torah, raising your children to learn Torah. V'adanet chavero v'kafshut. Now, what I find fascinating is hospitality to guests, right? Visiting the sick, and judging one another favorably require that I be in the horizontal. The only one that is really only between here and us and God is prayer. Even the Beit Midrash requires that I build the Beit Midrash with others. In other words, the world to come can only exist if in this world we have strong relationships within family and community that create the relationship with God, right? There has to be a continuous, continuous movement between the horizontal and the vertical. And 4 of these really require, I would even go as far as 5, Ben Adam L'Chavero, more than Ben Adam L'Makom. And I think that's the point, right? God is to some degree mivater al atzmo so that we can be in relationship with one another as long as we recognize the Tzelem Elokim in everyone, right? As long as that is what brings us towards a greater, deeper connection to God. So take a look at the Maharal, who says just this. I'm on page 2. When one extends hospitality to guests, he is welcoming human beings who are created in God's image. In this way, hospitality is greater than receiving the divine image because connection with the divine presence is limited, but connecting with the divine image embodied by a person is complete. Again, there's so much to do there to try to understand. I think we can take this on a very simplistic level, and then we need to begin to go deeper. But this idea that Avram's relationship with God, sitting there, in the heat of the day and so on, is a limited relationship, but his relationship with human beings is infinite. If each of them embody the Tzelem Elokim, he can go so much more deeper in what he can do for human beings who have Tzelem Elokim than what he can do for God. He can't really do for God anything. He can have conversation with God. He can reflect the radiance of God as Moshe did, when he's Keren or Panav, but there's a limit to how deep I can go here without having action here in the here and now in this world. I think, again, it's a very powerful message to us that in our relationship with one another lies our relationship with God because of the Tzelem Elokim. And now here is a quote from Rabbeinu Bachaya, which also just kind of blew me away. It's quoted in a book called Avram's Journey. The Almighty is the great welcomer of guests. His hospitality made it possible for humanity to exist, for the world to come into being. To be means to share in the infinite being of the Almighty. The Almighty, like Avram, invites people to partake of his boundless existence. Creation is an act of hachnasat orchim. We are just strangers whom the Almighty has invited into his tent, which is the universe. How beautiful is the doctrine of tzimtzum, of contraction. What is creation if not withdrawal by God in order to make it possible for a world to emerge in space and time? Infinity steps aside and finitude is born. What is hachnasat orchim if not withdrawal by the master from a part of his home so that a stranger can occupy the empty part he vacates? And to me, it really, take that, this could be your Torah, this is it, this source. This idea that when we create, I was even thinking when a man and a woman decide to have a child, you end up, we know, you end up sacrificing part of your freedom, part of yourself in order to bring another person into your family. There is a tzimtzum that happens for every child you bring into your home, right? For every person you bring into your home. And that is meant to model God, who is mitzamtzem et atzmo in order to create, right? Creation requires tzimtzum, and the Rabbeinu Bechaya takes that to hospitality. It is true, when I invite people into my home, I have to give up a part of my home, right, in order to allow those people to be in that space. And I used it this week in a source sheet I made about community. In order for community to be effective, every person has to give up a little bit of self. In other words, we're all these complete selves, but in order to be in relationship with anyone else, you can't be fully yourself. I mean, you could be fully yourself because you shouldn't have to hide who you are. I'm not talking about that self, but you can't be selfish. And I'm not talking about selfish like it all has to be my way. But selfish in the sense that if I'm selfish, I can't include someone else in my community, in my family, in my home. So there has to be a selflessness, which requires tzimtzum, right? So, and that models God. And to bring people into our home requires a little bit of a withdrawal so that someone else can come in. And that's the only way I think that that community can be effective. And I think today, tzimtzum is contraction. It is the Kabbalistic word for what God had to do in order to create the world. Because God took up was everything, and he had to contract to make room for the universe, right? And so that the universe could exist, because the universe was completely God. And then God, to create, had to remove part of himself, contraction. That's the word tzimtzum, which appears in a lot of Kabbalistic texts. And I think, part of the challenge today with TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, social media, such a emphasis on self, on me. How do I look? How am I seen? How do others see me? How do I see others? Much too much on the seeing. Much too much. Today, our problem is the visual, no question, because there's so much frontal loading of let me show everyone how I look all the time, how happy I am, how great I am, how beautiful I am, how beautiful my life is, how victimized that too. Okay, how victimized I am, and I think one of the things we're beginning to see is the difficulty in then bringing individuals together into community because of that. Because it's very hard to let go. But I feel this way, but I am this way. Do I have to compromise who I am? Well, you don't have to compromise who you are, but you do have to make space for others. And sometimes that means letting go a little bit of who you are, or of the space you take up is probably a bit. You don't have to compromise on who you are, but you have to make space for someone else, which means that you have to be aware of another person coming into that space. And I do believe that we are looking at the beginning of a generation, and maybe some of you see it with your children, with your grandchildren. It's very challenging. We want to hear what you feel. We want to know who you are. On the other hand, not to the degree of making no room for anyone else. And that's very much a challenge of this, what's happening right now in this generation. So I think this Rabbeinu Bechaya, right, that God contracted himself in order to create the world, in order to invite us into his world. And then that is what we do every time we invite someone in. Now, what I want to quote, this is Rabbi James Jacobson Meisel's. He really has been revolutionary in the world of meditation, Jewish meditation, Jewish spirituality. He lives up in Kibbutz Hanaton, and he really runs, I forget the name, maybe someone knows it.
Something left.
Yeah, maybe the light of the heart, something. A lot of online courses having to do with Kabbalah and meditation and spirituality. And so he's going to say something very interesting here about Hachnasat Orchim. I'm going to share it with you. It's an interpretation. It might be a little too, I don't believe it's fluffy, but it's very psychologically driven. This welcoming is not only an external act, but also an internal one. Can we welcome all the internal visitors to our heart, the joy and sorrow, the anger and love, and in doing, create the healing and love that Eliezer and Avram do? He's talking about Rabbi Eliezer. The challenge of both Avram and Eliezer is, can we be this welcoming to both the external and internal guests which come to call? Can we relate with the warm, loving hospitality that Eliezer displayed in his indiscriminate welcoming of every visitor? It is very hard to do, but the reward is great. Indeed, we learn in the Talmud, Rav Yehuda said, welcoming guests is greater than receiving the face of the Shekhinah. Welcoming guests is even greater than receiving the Shekhinah, the divine presence, perhaps because guests are not always so pleasant. Now, by the way, I can stop there. He's going to go in a direction. When I read this, I was like, oh, that's bringing it all on. Yes.
Yeah, but
It's
internal guests are not always. So
That's what he's
pleasant.
about to go to. So you can read it tarti mashma. Sometimes we invite into our homes people who are difficult guests. Sometimes it's family members who are difficult family members, right? And what he says is there are some guests we rejoice to see at our door, pleasure, excitement, joy, love, and laughter. But there are others whom we see through the people we cringe before: shame, anger, doubt, malice, jealousy, confusion, discomfort, and fear, hoping if we do not open the door, they will just go away. By the way, notice the list of who we don't want to welcome is longer than the list of who we do want to welcome. And he basically says, we can't control, I'm going to the end, you're welcome to read it, and it's even a longer excerpt. We can't control who comes through, but if we do not, our face will never feel the sun, wind, and rain, the freshness, vitality, and beauty of life, nor will we feel the cold, the storm, the thunder, the lightning, the damp and drizzle, the hail and sleet. They may be unpleasant at times or even frightening, but they all have their beauty, the beauty of being true. And so what he's doing here is he's using this text. The reason I brought it, even though some of it I thought about external guests who we don't always want to welcome and how hard sometimes Hachnasat Orchim is. When my daughter calls and this happened last week, and I wanted to have a very quiet Shabbat, and she's like, oh, I'm bringing home some friends. I'm like, oh, right, that's what, Lech Lecha, Vayera, I've got to do this, right? Sometimes we don't want to have guests, even if they're lovely. Sometimes the guests we end up inviting are not easy guests to have. And so Hachnasat Orchim is not a simple mitzvah. Sometimes it's super easy, and we're like, wow, this is a mitzvah. And sometimes it's extremely challenging. The reason I brought Rabbi James, who was taught at Pardes for many years, is because that's a midrash. In other words, he's using the lens of interpretation. He's into meditation and spirituality and interpretation. And when he thinks of inviting guests in, he thinks about the Hachnasat Orchim within ourselves. Are we kind to all of the sensations, feelings, experiences, emotions we have? And we know that meditation is really about embracing all of it. It's about not ignoring those feelings of perhaps shame, confusion, fear, and so on, acknowledging them before gently moving them to the side, right? Because if we try to keep them out, they have a way of continuing, pushing at the door to get in. And only by acknowledging them can we make space for them, right? And then perhaps have a sense of freedom from those feelings. So I like it when there is a interpretive, lens that is, very different, but I think no less legitimate, right? When we think about Midrash, when we think about the Middle Ages and so on and so forth, Midrash is often built on the lens through which we begin reading the text. The beauty of the text is that it really can receive a lot of different interpretations. Ultimately, my own approach is you have to read the text first, know well what the text says, and then you can begin to find interpretive ideas within the text that might resonate with you. And so that's what Rabbi Meisels did. What I'd like to look at next is, because I'm drawn to Midrash, I'm going to bring you some of the, what I call the, I'm looking for a word, fantastical Midrash, right? I'm going to bring a fantastical Midrash next. Before doing that, as I was preparing, there was a new idea I heard about Sarah laughing. So I'd like to just quickly share that with you before going to kind of the last Midrashim I'm going to bring. Yes, we are good for time. So skip to the story where I want to show you something in the text that really, no matter how many times you read it, I didn't notice this. We're in chapter 18, verse 12. Yud Bet, Parak Yud Chet, Pasuk Yud Bet. Okay. Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba lemor, acharei v'loti hayta li ena v'adoni zaken. And so Sarah laughed within herself and basically said, after I have reached the age, of bloti, which seems to be like postmenopause, but after the age of like no longer being fertile, will I become fertile? And my master is old. So she seems to have two concerns. One is for the fertility within her own body, and one is with the fact that her even if that could happen, well, my master is old. The Midrash, by the way, says something interesting. Vatitzchak Sarah bikroveha, What they say is as follows, that in the Septuagint, and I checked this, this is true, they changed the language, not bikirba bikroveha, because she laughed among her acquaintances. Why? Like she publicly laughed. And that is why she was censured. Because if she laughed within herself, and this was always difficult for me, why is she being censured? Avram also laughed. I mean, we have that problem. Avram also laughs in disbelief and falls on his face like, what, really? And so in order, the Midrash says that Talmai, the King Talmai, who ordered the Septuagint, that's the Midrashic narrative, not mock or censure the biblical text, they changed the reading of the word from kirba to kroveha, so then Sarah's crime becomes clearer, Sarah's transgression, that she mocked publicly, whereas Avram had been in disbelief privately. So I'm just showing this appears in a number of places where the Midrashic author is aware of the Septuagint and acknowledges certain changes that are made in the translation into Greek in order to avoid any theological questions about God usually. And here the idea was it wouldn't be theologically fair for God to censure Sarah, given that Avram had done the same thing if they were both laughing in disbelief privately, right? So I'm just showing you again a Midrashic methodology, how the Midrash works, and bringing in the Septuagint, which is a non-Jewish translation.
We lost the sound.
We can't hear you. We lost the sound.
How did you know?
Now it's better, I think.
Oh, then stop, then you stop.
Okay, thank you. Yes, luckily Yardena comes in as soon as she sees signs. She's really on the ball. So Vayomer Adonai Avram, so why did Sarah laugh? Does Sarah hayi pale me Adonai davar? Okay, so we know God responds. Is this too far from God to do? This time next year, Sarah will have a son. Vatikachesh Sarah lemor lo tzachakti ki yarea v'yomar lo kitzachakt. Ki yarea v'yomar lo kitzachakt. Who's the Vayomer? How do we always read it? Who do we think speaks there? God. But it doesn't say God.
No.
Who's the other person it could be? Did you think it was Avram?
Yes.
You've always thought it was Avram?
Always.
Always thought it was Avram. Interesting. I have to say, it's the first time I saw a commentary that said they think it's Avraham who says to her, no, you laughed, right? It's not between Sarah and God. And that was kind of changed, that she's not afraid of God. She's afraid of Avraham.
Right.
That God has protected her. God has protected her in Paro's house. God is the one who has promised her a son. And so she has a trust in God. And Avram is the one who, of course, who allowed her to be taken into Pharaoh's house. Avram is the one who contributed to the dynamic between Hagar and Sarai a few prakim ago. And it really changed for me. I'm impressed. I always thought it was God who said, no, you laughed. And I was very bothered by that. Like, why is God being so harsh with Sarah, who largely behaves the way Avram did? And God uses it instead to say to Avram, I know that she laughed. Does she is she in such disbelief? This time next year, it's going to happen, right? It's very similar to the way God speaks to Avram in chapter 17, where Avram also says, well, Lu Yishmael Yechia Lefanecha, and then God says, no, you're going to have a child named Yitzchak. I'm going to do this. And Avram laughs like he can't believe this. And I feel like God is speaking to Avram in a similar tone, like tell Sarah not to disbelieve. And then she, then there's this bizarre interaction with her and Avram.
But
Yeah.
you can see even here, God's protecting her because she says,
Yes.
Adoni Zakein.
Right.
And he doesn't.
He doesn't give that. He doesn't give that. The Midrash points that out. That's the next Midrash after the Septuagint Midrash, that God comes in as a mediator, as like a counselor, Shalom Bayit. Yes, very nice. No, really, that reinforces my reading that it's Avram she's nervous. I don't want to get caught by Avram, right? I didn't know. Yeah, very nice. Okay, so very interesting. Take a look where Sarah actually laughs in joy. It's Perek Kaf Aleph. We've already seen some of that Perek. And in that Perek, we have Vadonai pakadet Sarah, and pasuk. Hold on, I want to get to the pasuk. Mimi lel verse Zion. Vatomer Mimi lel Avram hinika banim Sarah ki aladati ben liskunav. What we have here are a series of midrashim where Sarah opens her shirt, and I have no other way, and begins breastfeeding all of the children wide and far. It's actually both startling that it's in the midrash. I brought 3 different midrashim: Breshit Rabbah, Midrash Tanchuma, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Breshit Rabbah has Sarah. I'm just going to paraphrase because I must get to the last source. But Breshit Rabbah has this idea that Avram basically says to her, "This is Enzo Sha'ah Hatzmiut," which I think some young ladies today would like to quote. Enzo Sha'ah Hatzmiut, Galia Dadech, bear your breasts, which is just like astonishing, because he knows that this is an hour in which God, not just mercy, God's wondrous miracle of the fertility of a woman of 90 is revealed. And then it says, essentially, there are fountains of milk streaming, right? It's just this miraculous sight far and wide. In Midrash Tanchuma, the women of the day come and kind of to test her, leave their wet nurses at home, and then the babies start to cry, and they, oh, well, we didn't bring any milk, and she nurses everybody, right? So, and in the third source that brings this idea, there are more, but these are just 3, that Sarah begins to nurse all of these babies and gave suck to all their children in peace, right? That shalom is being brought between Avram and all of the nations around through breastfeeding, which I think women can bring about the peace, so to speak, through this nurturing quality. So really just very astonishing midrash. I think it's meant to shock us a little bit, wake us up a little bit, but also this reinforcing of the miraculousness of fertility, right? The fact that she is so fertile, that the nursing, the milk is a sign of her fertility. The last source, here we are, the last midrash, and this is where we will lead off. Anyone have a question or a comment on Zoom before I move to the last source, which is going to really model how we see what's going on around the midrashic author being brought into the midrash. Okay, that's what we're about to see, that this is taking place after Islam has conquered the land of Israel, and we're going to see why that's significant in the midrash. Anyone there have a question or comment?
Well, just that midrash is so beautiful. The one about the breastfeeding.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes, and I'm not surprised that you
Kol hakavod to the rabbis,
Yes, that they weren't afraid of it. If anything, you see they're inspired. They find it a beautiful image. Yishmael, Hagar, and Keturah. So I read a pasuk where Hagar goes to Mitzrayim to take a wife for Yishmael. And by the way, when we get to Toldot and Esav, my critique of Yitzchak and Rivka is they don't marry him off. He has to marry himself off. Hagar gets it. There's no father in the picture now. She has to be mother and father. She finds him a wife. But take a look at this midrash. I'm going to read it in the English. According to another tradition, Yishmael married a Moabite woman. Avram went to visit his son 3 years after he had sent Hagar away. So in this midrash, first of all, it's important. Avram doesn't forget his son. He goes to visit him. He swore to Sarah that he would not descend from the camel at the place where Yishmael was. Avram arrived there at midday and found Yishmael's wife there. He asked her, "Where is Yishmael?" She replied, "He and his mother went to bring fruits and dates from the wilderness." He asked of her, "Give me some bread and water, for I am tired from the rigors of the journey through the wilderness." She answered, "I have neither water nor bread." He told her, "When Yishmael comes, tell this to him. Say to him that an old man came from the land of Canaan to see you. And he said, change the threshold of your household, which is not good for you." When Yishmael returned from the wilderness, she told him this. The son of a wise man is like half a wise man himself. And Yishmael understood, and he sent his mother to take a wife for him from his father's house named Fatima. 3 years later, Avram went to visit his son Yishmael, and he swore to Sarah like the first time that he would not descend from the camel on the place where Yishmael dwelled. Avram arrived there at midday and found Yishmael's wife there. He asked her, "Where is Yishmael?" She replied, "He and his mother went to herd the camels in the wilderness." He asked of her, "Give me some bread and water, for I am tired from the rigors of the journey through the wilderness." She brought forth bread and water and gave them to him. Avram stood and prayed to God, and Yishmael's house was filled with bounty and blessing. When Yishmael came back, his wife told him what had happened. And he understood that even now his father had had mercy for him as a father for his children. Now, what's interesting, I'll just point out a few things, and I'll talk a little bit about what the Midrash, I think some of it is clear. First of all, this is written after the Islamic conquest of Eretz Yisrael, and it exudes Muslim influence. Fatima is the name of the daughter of Muhammad.
Yeah.
Right, so the wife of Ishmael is given the same name as the daughter of Muhammad. And there's a Muslim-Jewish polemic here. Why? The sanctity in Islamic tradition, the place of Abraham is near the Kaaba in Mecca, and it bears his footprints. Right, that's the Islamic tradition that Abraham walked those steps to the place of Abraham. In the Midrash, he doesn't get off the camel. It's very interesting, right? And so Chokrim recognized that this is a refutation of the idea that Abraham would have walked. He doesn't get off the camel. However, what I think is beautiful here and what bothers the Midrash and the Midrash fills in is that Avram continues to guide Yishmael even after he is sent away. And Yishmael is ultimately successful because his father Avram continues to educate him from a distance. He responds to the education. So the relationship continues. We know that when Avram dies, Yishmael and Yitzchak come to bury Abraham. So that the Midrash is aware of that. That's in the text. And it fills in this narrative that Avram doesn't alodot beno, right? It's very hard, we know in the story, that Avram does not want to let go of Yishmael. He doesn't really want to send Yishmael away. He's forced to send Yishmael away. God says, listen to Sarah, right? Again, listen to Sarah, your wife. And he does it reluctantly. I think the bread and water is a sign a little bit of his own reluctance, right? Because it makes no sense. Avram is a generous person. And here in this Midrash, we have him making the journey, which is a considerable journey, to go check up on his son. He doesn't stick around to see his son. Okay, it's a story, but he comes and checks and leaves a message and then checks again and brings him blessing and bounty. So I think that here the Midrash functions in a very positive way, filling in the narrative. And in addition to us as readers, it explains to us a little bit about where Midrashic ideas come from, right? So the name Fatima would be a name familiar, right? On one hand, daughter of Muhammad, that would make sense, right? Monotheism and so on. On the other hand, he doesn't get off the camel because we don't believe in that tradition that Abraham makes his way all the way to Mecca.
He stood and prayed to God.
No, but he doesn't. Well, so maybe he does.
Doesn't mean there.
Doesn't mean there. Doesn't mean there. She
Doesn't
brought
mean
forth.
there.
Yeah, you're right. Let me just see in Hebrew because it says he swore to Sarah he would not descend from the camel. It's you're right. It's funny. But yeah, let me just see what the Hebrew is. Amad Avraham v'yamid palel. So where does he do that? You're right. It's right there.
I mean, to me, it implies. it's
He
right
gets
there.
off the camel. He does get off the camel to pray
Exactly.
before getting back on the camel. I have to look into that. Because my understanding was this was a way of saying the footsteps were not our tradition, that's your tradition.
You don't know if he did it
Maybe
at
he
that point.
stands on the camel,
No.
or he does it later.
It doesn't say that
Right.
because you can't interpret it as.
Well,
On
the
the
simple.
No, but it says here in the Hebrew, V'hotzia lechem umayim v'natnalo, Amad Avraham. The truth is, the Amad Avraham v'hayam mitpalel. You don't know, it might be later.
Simplest interpretation is he did it right there. That's why Ishmael.
Right. The Hebrew is not clear, actually. The Hebrew is a hayam mitpalel, and he would pray, which suggests late when he goes back home and he begins to pray again. Yeah, I have to say, I think that they're very clear that he doesn't get off the camel, that Sarah says, do not get off the camel, but she allows him to go, right? Notice again, there is a partnership there into what the boundaries are going to be in this relationship. Anyway, so that I'm going to take some questions now. Just to summarize, we saw, as I said, three different narratives, really 3.5. We saw Hagar, the seeing and being seen. I'm going to let you think about it and discuss it. The El Roi versus the Yishmael, which I think continues to be resonant in the stories of Hagar and Yishmael. We talked about Haknasat Orchim and that beautiful text from Rabbeinu Bachaya, which I think, again, a lot of depth there to do with. And then we finished with a few midrashim around Sarah nursing, the way midrash functions in acknowledging the beauty of a woman nursing, what that represents in terms of fertility and care for, there's something, they find the image obviously very beautiful and very poignant. And that last midrash with Yishmael and Hagar and not Keturah, Keturah is going to be next week, with Avram continuing to be very much involved in his son who he has sent away his life. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and now Sandy and me.
So, really quickly, you mentioned a few times about how you struggle with the part where Avram sends Ishmael and Hagar away with one day, like
Yeah.
a little bit of
The
ration.
food.
And
Thank you.
I want to suggest that maybe perhaps it is because of the reluctance that Avram had, that he didn't want them to go too far. If he had given them a large ration, they could travel many days
That's a
away.
very nice reading that he's kind of
And far
hoping
away, so he's kind of hoping that
maybe they'll come
stay
back.
close
Maybe
by,
that's the
and maybe
subtext.
you can run after, or maybe, something else.
That's a beautiful reading. I will say that he sends them with very little, with the hope that they'll stumble and come
stay
stumbling back for
nearby.
more and stay nearby.
They don't have
That's
to
very
go
nice.
far.
I really like that. That's a very compassionate
Thank
read.
you.
Yeah, that's a beautiful read. Sandy?
The second wife, Fatima,
Yeah.
is from Abraham's house.
Yes, very interesting. Yeah.
They're in our room.
I don't know what we believe. They believe obviously Muhammad is a descendant of Yishmael, is a descendant of Abraham. So then you would keep that's what Esav does too. He goes back and takes the daughter of Yishmael. So it makes sense to me that again, the only compassion that's going to come out of Avram is that you're going to have a woman from Avram's house. But yes,
But doesn't Avram only have multiple children?
later.
Yeah.
It's not, it can't be,
Avram's
well,
house doesn't mean his child.
from Avram's household, right? It doesn't necessarily mean his child, from within the household. Right? But so there, clearly the Islamic influence is the connection between Muhammad and Abraham, right? That Fatima would be coming out, yeah. That Fatima, his daughter, is a descendant of Abraham.
It's a little question. All of these things.
Yes,
There's Abraham, when he at Kedah, he doesn't see.
right. Yes,
He
absolutely.
doesn't see
Sight
them,
is
and
right.
then all of a sudden he sees it. And then
Yes.
he- And Sarah is there, and she doesn't see the water,
She doesn't.
and also she sees it.
Hagar
It's a
Hagar
different
doesn't see
kind of
that,
seeing.
right.
It's a
Right,
seeing and
yeah,
knowing.
no, this chapter, this Parsha has a lot of seeing in it, seeing and not seeing. And I think it really does start from the Be'er L'Chai Roi, which is where Yitzchak's gonna end up. I think there's a lot to, again, mine from that. But anyone on Zoom have something they want to
I
say?
have a question. I have a question.
Yes.
Why do you think that Hagar is absent deliberately from the narrative? I mean, it's kind
Of
of
the narrative
unusual.
of this narrative, the last.
No, of the midrash.
Yeah, I think she's absent because of that. No, she's not really absent. Remember, he's off with his mother bringing fruits and dates.
Right, but she's not there. She's
What?
not there to see Abraham come.
Yeah. I think.
And that's I think that's deliberate. And I'm wondering,
I know, I think you're
why
right.
the
I think you're right. I think in the story, neither of them are there. I think I was actually moved by he and his mother are doing what normally he and a father would do, right? Going out to with the camels or going out with the sheep or going out with the crops or whatever it is. Normally a father and son. And what I read when I was reading it is he and his mother have that relationship, right? She married him off and she's still very much the parent in his life. And for the purpose of the story, they're not there, meaning, that Avram is able to educate, even though Yishmael isn't there. But I was drawn by the togetherness of Hagar and Yishmael. That's what I took. That's what I took from the story, that she ends up functioning as the man in the household. That's what I saw. But I think that, again, from the storyteller's perspective, what would we gain from Hagar and Avram interacting? The Midrash has Hagar marrying. We're going to see that next week. Hagar will be the one to marry him after Sarah dies. So that would be complicated, right? Like Midrashim don't have to agree with each other. That's for sure. They don't have to sync, but we will have Midrashim that reunite Avram and Hagar. This Midrash didn't need to do that. It has Ishmael and Hagar very much together doing the things a father would potentially do with his son. That's what I would say. Anyone else before we say goodbye? Yes, thank you. Thank you to all of those. And I'm taking one more question and then class will be over. Yes.
It's never mentioned anywhere. When I hear the story, I think Hagar's supposed to have this baby. He's supposed to be